I think we're getting ready to get going here. Big round of applause for the audio guys who had to change everything over in 2 minutes. Thanks. So if you came to the workers and the session on workers and the Petro-State, you're in the right place, which is and we're locking the doors, so you can't leave for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jerry Taves. I am an executive liaison with Health Sciences Association of Alberta, and I'm happy to be the facilitator for this session today. We have two amazing speakers for you, one of whom I met for the first time about 15 minutes ago, and one who I've known now for several years. I'm going to introduce Gil first and let him do his speak, and then I'll introduce Bob a little bit later on, if that's okay with everybody. I got to know Gil, I don't know when, it was about 3 years ago now, something like that, when he was kind enough to hire me in Alberta when I needed a job. And it was a great time. We traveled the province together doing something called Join Together Alberta, which was a very interesting time. But during that time, he really gave me my best understanding of how Alberta is a Petro-State and how it all sort of works together. He's done a lot of work on this over the years, amongst other things, including healthcare and things. But one of his pet passions is definitely talking about oil and gas and workers in that field. So without further ado, I should give you just a couple of announcements before I get going with the speakers, just how this is all going to be set up. Each of the speakers is going to talk for approximately 20 minutes, and then we're going to have 35 minutes to talk together. It's going to be different than what happens in the main plenary when it's going to be where it's question and answer. What I'm hoping that we'll have is a chance to have a discussion. We're a small group. This is your real opportunity to have your input, your say, and people who haven't had a chance to speak or to ask questions will be given preference at that time. If you're tweeting, by the way, there are some people who are tweeting the thing. The hashtag is hashtag Park, PARKCONF, short for conference, ParkConf. So that's it. So without further ado, Gil, take it away.
Okay. Plugged in? Yeah? Okay. So if you were there this morning, you heard Andrew talking about Alberta as a Petro-State, and in Petro-States, there is an official line, there's an official story that's told about the petroleum resource and what it means to the economy. So if you've grown up here, if you live here, you know about that story. We hear it over and over again. So for example, we're told that the oil sands are a vast resource, 176 billion barrels in reserve, making our reserve the third largest in the world after Saudi Arabia and Russia. We're told that it's an incredibly valuable resource. In fact, the engine of the... Sorry. And so when they talk about the oil sands as the engine of the provincial and national economy, there's a lot of truth in it. So for example, last year, half of all the jobs created in Canada were created right here in Alberta, largely as a result of development in the oil sands. To put it in perspective, the industry is spending between $10 and $20 billion a year on oil sands related development. And oil sands production has, for the last 4 or 5 years, surpassed production from conventional oil. And the oil sands have also replaced natural gas as the key driver for royalties for our provincial government. In addition, we know that the oil sands have created wealth and income on an unprecedented scale. So for example, as a result of development in the oil sands, Alberta companies spend more than twice as much as BC and Saskatchewan put together on capital projects in an average year, which creates a lot of employment. We also have a situation where corporations have seen their profits in this province increase by 400% over the last decade. Our GDP per capita is more than 70% higher than the Canadian average. And it's not just our corporations and high income earners who are beneficiaries. We also have the lowest unemployment rate and the highest average wages. So, you know, this is the dominant story about the oil sands. And frankly, a lot of it's true. It's true that it's a vast resource. It's true that it's a valuable resource. It's true that it's a resource through the development of which is creating a lot of jobs. It's true that people are earning a lot of money. But there's another side of the story, a side that's familiar to a lot of us who have lived in this province for a long time, a story that sometimes we only understand in bits and pieces because we don't often see the whole picture. But it's a story that's very different than the dominant narrative. So this morning, I want to tell you a little bit about that alternative story about the oil sands. In particular, I don't want to diminish the concerns or the conversation that needs to be had about the environmental implications of the oil sands. But for our purpose today, I want to talk about the alternative story on the oil sands and the impact that it has on working people and the labor market, not only in Alberta, but across the country. Because I'm going to make an argument this morning, and the argument goes like this. The oil sands are a valuable resource, a resource that's going to be developed in one way or another, whether we like it or not. And it's not the oil sands that are the bad guy, necessarily. It's the way that our governments and our corporations have decided to exploit and develop the resource that is causing problems. And in order to understand how our approach to development is raising concerns for workers in the broader labor market, we have to understand two things. First of all, when it comes to the approach to developing the oil sands, our governments, who are the stewards of this resource on behalf of the public who collectively own it, first and foremost have taken a hands-off approach to development. So all the key decisions about when to develop, how to develop, these decisions are not made by the citizens as the owners of the resource or the government as the steward of the resource. These decisions are made almost entirely by industry itself. So, for example, in the oil sands, in order to develop a property, the government has to provide sell lease agreements, and they have to give approvals. This is a government that has basically, there hasn't been an approval, there hasn't been an application for a project approval that's gone across the government desk in the last 25 years that hasn't been approved, okay? So that leads us to the second characterization of our current approach to development, and that has to do with pace. So these are the two problems. We've got a hands-off approach by the owner of the resource, and we have an unbridled Wild West approach to the pace of development. And I'm going to run through about the top 10 harmful effects of this hands-off Wild West approach to development and what it has meant for working people here in Alberta and also across the country. The first thing that's happened, which you actually have heard about as part of the dominant discussion about the oil sands, is that the fast pace of development in the oil sands has led to a tight labor market and outright labor shortages, at least in certain important trades related to construction. okay? And to put this in perspective, as it stands right now, there are more than 65 major multi-billion-dollar oil sands projects that are either approved or under construction right now, employing thousands and thousands of tradespeople. This is something that even people here in Alberta don't realize the scope and scale of, because the work is being done, you know, far in the north where most of us never see. But the reality is that there are more than 50,000 workers in camps around Fort McMurray right now working on oil sands projects, and more to come. The fact that this has created a labor shortage has led also to cost escalation, and that's another part of that you hear as part of the dominant discussion. But I'm going to explain to you why that's a concern to working people. So labor shortages, fast pace, unregulated pace leads to labor shortages, leads to cost escalation. And when we hear in the business press or from conservative politicians about cost escalation in oil sands related construction, they leave the impression that it's those greedy workers, right? But the reality is that the reason that costs are escalating in the oil sands has to do with productivity. In particular, productivity is plummeting because there's so many projects on the go at one time that energy companies and construction companies can't find the right people to do the right jobs at the right time. The result are delays, which drive up the cost. In fact, just a couple of months ago, there was an investment firm called Raymond James that did a study on rising costs in oil sands related construction. And it's interesting, you should read these kind of reports because capitalists are most honest when they're talking with other capitalists. And what they showed is that over the last 10 years, every major oil sands project developed in Fort McMurray has come in over budget, an average of 100% over budget, and in some cases as much as 260% over budget. And so they asked the question, is it because of wages? Well, over that period, wages for construction workers went up 22%, which is okay, just barely more than inflation. But the costs were going up over by as much as 260% over. So the problem was too many projects at the same time. So that leads to the third problem, which is that the labor shortage and the cost escalation have led employers and governments to embrace what we would describe as harmful labor market strategies. So for example, in order to throw more warm bodies on work sites in the oil sands regions, our government has watered down our apprenticeship training rules. So for example, we used to have codified ratios about how many journeymen had to be on a work site for apprentices. This was to ensure a high level of training. Perhaps not surprisingly, under pressure from government, from industry, government has watered down the ratios, so there are fewer journeymen to train apprentices. That's one concrete example. Another example is the introduction and expansion of the temporary foreign worker program. 10 years ago, under the program, there were maybe 7,000 temporary foreign workers in the province. Today, there are 70,000, and just this last year, the federal government, which administers the program, has approved 75,000, that's thousands, 75,000 what we call labor market opinions, which are the applications that employers have to submit to government in order to get a temporary foreign worker. So if all of those LMOs lead to actual temporary foreign workers on the ground, we could very quickly see a population, a temporary foreign worker population in excess of 120,000 in short order. So this in turn has, on the subject of temporary foreign workers, this has significant concerns for the labor market because this is an exploitable workforce. Right now the industry is expecting that in construction related to the oil sands, in the next 5 years, about 30% of the construction labor force is going to be temporary foreign workers in Fort McMurray, up from about 15% right now. It's even more dramatic on the service side. In the service sector, the majority of temporary farm workers in the province are actually working in the service sector. For the trades guys, though, employers are choosing temporary farm workers not as a last resort, but in many cases as a first choice, because it's cheaper, faster, and easier for them to grab a temporary farm worker from somewhere overseas than to train an apprentice here in Alberta. Okay, and as it stands right now, only about half of our construction companies that are operating in the oil sands are actually taking on any apprentices at all. Okay, so that we're not training the next generation of construction tradespeople, and these companies that don't have any training apprenticeship training programs in place are actually being granted LMOs to bring temporary farm workers into the country. So they're saying the government is essentially facilitating their ability to ignore training. In addition, so just a couple of things about temporary farm workers. I can't read my own notes here. So what we have here is we've created a large and growing underclass of vulnerable and disempowered workers. As I said, the temporary farm worker program is becoming a first choice rather than a last resort. And this is a particularly vulnerable population because they're here at the behest of their employers and can be sent home if they rock the boat or ask uncomfortable questions. And so employers knowing this, I won't say all employers do this, but many employers will take advantage of this vulnerability to impose working conditions on these workers that would not be acceptable to Canadians. So the result is that these workers end up being used as pawns to drive down wages and conditions, not only for temporary farm workers, but also for all Canadians. And that's a big concern, so this is having an impact on the labor market. And I want to make it clear that the connection between what's happening with temporary farm workers and the oil sands is a strong one. In fact, I remember in the first couple of months after Stephen Harper got his first minority government, one of the first things that he did was convene a meeting of energy industry CEOs at a fancy ballroom in the Hotel McDonald, and somehow I got an invitation to that meeting. They never made that mistake again. But at that meeting, the new Harper government and their deputy ministers and ministers for HRDC and other departments, they went to the industry and said, we want to be helpful to the oil industry. We see that as our role, is to facilitate growth in the oil sands sector. So what can we do to help you? And they went around the table, and to a man, and they were almost all men, they said, we want more temporary farm workers. And within months, the program was expanded to allow more tradespeople to come in through the program. And then when the service sector employers saw what a great deal the employers in the construction sector were getting, they demanded similar treatment, and of course, because they had friends in Ottawa, they got that. And so in addition to these questionable approaches to managing the tight labor market in the oil sands, non-union employers, especially in construction, have been exploiting this situation with growing concern about labor shortage and cost escalation. They've been exploiting this situation to make what I would describe as mischief with labor legislation, to settle scores and to tip the playing field in their favor. So for example, armed with all these arguments about the labor shortage and rising costs in the oil sands, groups like the Merit Contractors Association, which represents non-union construction firms, have over the last year and a half, especially since the Harper government won its long sought after majority, they have been lobbying hard for regulatory and legal changes that will allow them to push unionized construction firms to the margins. So for example, it was the Merit Contractors who were behind the push to eliminate something called the Fair Wages Act at the federal level. That was one of the items that was included in that massive omnibus budget bill that the Harper government passed last year. Because Lord knows we can't have any fair wages in Alberta, but it was really about that legislation had covered federally regulated industries, including pipelines. And the reason they wanted to get rid of that legislation is because it would have required non-union firms to pay similar rates to union firms working on pipeline projects. okay? And that was included in the omnibus bill. In addition, we've got other mischief. We've got, many of you have probably heard about how last April the federal government changed the rules for the temporary foreign worker program to speed up approvals so that the employers no longer had to prove that they couldn't find Canadians to do jobs. And they also allowed employers to pay as much as 15% less for temporary foreign workers than they would pay to Canadians doing similar work. Okay, so this is again a direct result of lobbying from the non-union sector, and they've been using this pace of development and the cost that's imposing on the industry to justify these changes. The next thing that number 7, the other harmful result of this rapid pace of development of the oil sands is that it's been putting the dreams of many Albertans out of reach when it comes to the kind of economic development that we'd like to see in this province. Poll after poll has shown that the vast majority of Albertans, something like 85%, would prefer to see us moving up the value ladder instead of down, that they would like to see us refining and upgrading more of our bitumen instead of exporting it to places like the United States and China, keep those jobs instead of sending them down the pipeline. But because of the rising costs associated with this unreasonable pace of development, companies are now saying that we can't afford to build the more expensive value-added projects. So by failing to set a reasonable pace for development in the oil sands, the government, in effect, has priced the more desirable projects out of the market. And in fact, right now, when Stelmach was premier, he promised that we would upgrade 72% of bitumen in this province before exporting it. It's really, over the last couple of years, it's averaged about 60%. It's dropping to 50% within the next year. And we learned, as a result of our involvement in the Northern Gateway Pipeline hearings, that within the next 5 years, just 5 years, they're expecting that the proportion of bitumen upgraded in Alberta will drop to 26%, the lowest ever. Okay, and it's not that they're closing down upgraders. It's just that all the new production that's coming online, virtually every drop of it, is going to be exported in its raw form. Okay, man. So number 8, it's harmful because the approach to this hands-off approach to development, allowing corporations to decide, has allowed them to make decisions that are in the best interests that might be in the best interests of their corporation, but are not necessarily in the best interests of Alberta. So for example, all this push to export raw bitumen, it's being driven by a lot of American-based companies that have refining capacity in places like the American Gulf Coast, and it's cheaper for them to send the raw bitumen to those plants than to build a plant here. So even though it might make sense for Exxon to send the bitumen down there, just our point is that what's in the best interest of Exxon isn't necessarily in the best interest of Albertans who own the resource. In addition, there's also the issue of Dutch disease, okay? And I won't go into detail about what that means. Andrew explained it, but the reality is that this is not something that environmentalists have cooked up. It's not something that Thomas Mulcair is fantasizing about. The reality is that the Canadian dollar has increased in lockstep with the price of oil, and this is supported by the OECD. It's supported by studies commissioned by the Alberta government, and for us here in Alberta, I just, because people say this is an Eastern problem, but here in Alberta we have a manufacturing industry. We have quite a vibrant manufacturing industry that has been most closely associated with the energy sector. We make pipe, we make machinery to service the energy sector. But even as our energy sector has been growing, something disturbing has been happening with our manufacturing sector here in Alberta. We've actually lost 18,500 jobs in manufacturing over the last 10 years, even though our energy sector has grown, okay? Because our own homegrown Alberta manufacturers can't compete with Chinese companies making pipe and making components, okay? Because we're, so to say that the only Eastern manufacturers are being affected by this is simply not true. The final two things I'm going to mention in terms of the effects on the labor market have to do with royalties and income inequality, okay? On the subject of royalties, this is a labor issue because all the public sector workers in this province who provide healthcare, education, municipal services rely on the money on revenue coming into the government to be spent on public services. But what's happening because of this Wild West approach to development is driving up the costs. This is of concern to public sector workers because our royalty system is dependent on cost. Okay, in particular, we have a royalty system for oil sands that basically allows companies to pay a 1% royalty on revenue until their capital costs are paid off. So if the costs are allowed to balloon, as they have, then that pushes off the horizon at which the public, as the owner of the resource, can get a higher royalty rate. So as a result of this rapid pace of development, we've actually foregone literally billions and billions of dollars in royalty revenue that could be coming to the public either for savings or for spending on things that matter to us, like healthcare and education. The final thing that I'll mention in terms of the labor market and what's happening with development in the oil sands is its profound effects on growing inequality in our province. Because while it's true we have money is pouring into this province, a lot of people are earning more than they ever have. We also have the dubious distinction of seeing the largest rates of increase in income inequality in the country, and it's directly a result of the kind of economy that our economy has become. So right now, the top 1% of earners in Alberta have gotten to the point where they make more than double what the top 1% earn in other provinces. While at the same time, we have about 25% of wage earners in this province making less than $15 an hour. Okay, so we're not quite the most unequal society in Canada yet, but we're closing the gap. And if this trend continues with the next 4 or 5 years, we will have the greatest income disparity in the country. You put that in growing gap between rich and poor together with the rising use and abuse of temporary foreign workers. And we've got more and more people, especially low-wage Canadian workers, looking at those temporary foreign workers and blaming them for their low wages or for losing their jobs. And so I'm concerned that there's a social explosion brewing there, right? So growing income inequality, lack of social cohesion between new immigrants. Actually, I shouldn't say immigrants because the temporary farm worker program is not immigration. Most of these people will not be allowed to stay in the country. It's exploitation. It's not immigration. It's exploitation. But so we're setting up a situation where income inequality and lack of social cohesion are going to cause real problems, not just for the labor market, but for the province in general. So, sorry, I went a little over there.
Excellent. No, thanks. I realize. Thanks, Gil. I realized when I sat down that I didn't actually introduce who Gil is. Gil McGowan is the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour, but I'm assuming that everyone here in this room is literate and can read the program. Dr. Bob Barnetson is our next speaker, and he's an associate professor of labour relations at Athabasca University. And not going to go into a whole bunch of detail because I don't know a lot of detail. I'll let Bob talk about himself and take it away. Did you want to use this mic or okay? Just a reminder that after this, then we're going to go into a general discussion with preference going to people who haven't had a chance to make any comments yet at the conference.
Groovy, thank you very much. I'm Bob, and I'm a prof at Athabasca, and that's all I'm going to talk about myself here today. But what I'd like to talk to you about is workplace injury in Alberta. And what I'd like to talk to you specifically about is the high level of injury and why the government does nothing about it. So I know we have a period of time at the end of my presentation for questions and conversation and probably personal attack. You never know how these things are going to go, right? But I'd like to start out by asking you folks some questions. So who here, show of hands, knows somebody, maybe even yourself, who's had or has a workplace injury? Yeah, workplace injury. Do you know anybody who's had a workplace injury? Yeah, okay. So we have about 40 people here in the room, and almost everybody's hands went up. which I think tells you a lot, something very important about workplace injuries. So I have one. I have a bit of repetitive strain injury in my wrists because I'm a prof and I type all day long. But I'd like to hear what other injuries you folks know about. Just call out your injuries, or the injuries of somebody else. Yes, ma'am. Meniscus in the knee. That's very good. Who else? Yes, ma'am. Okay, well, we have a winner. I'm very sorry to hear that. So we have fatality. Other types of injuries. Broken bones. Fair enough. Back problems. Yes. Shoulder injury. Long-term kind of problem. Oh, yes, assault in the workplace, violence. Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty typical response when I ask this kind of questions. You see a range of injuries, everything from, pretty minor stuff, right, like my wrist, on up to a fatality. Anybody want to guess how many occupational injuries there are in Alberta in an average year? Just call out a number. 500,000. We have a big spender in the audience here. Alvin Finkel, everybody. Anybody want a more realistic number? Do I hear 10,000? 10,000? 15,000? 30,000. All right. Do I have 35? No. Pardon me? 50,000. Okay, 50,000. Do I hear 75? No. 82. Do I hear 100? 8250. Oh, come on. You can go higher than 8250. Do I hear 200,000? Anybody think there's 200,000 injuries in Alberta a year? Couple of hands. 300. Anybody want to go 4? No, Alvin was right. There's actually 500,000 injuries in Alberta workplaces every year, which is a pretty staggering number when you consider there's only 2 million workers, ballpark, in Alberta each year. So 500,000 injuries. What's really interesting is that the government never talks about that. Government never talks about 500,000 injuries. When you look at government reports on workplace injuries, they're going to tell you each year there's 150 occupational fatalities, and there's about 50,000 serious injuries. If you look at their press releases or other documents, they don't talk about any of the other injuries that go on in Alberta. But if you look at WCB statistics, the Worker Compensation Board stats, for whatever they're worth, right away you can see there's another 100,000 injuries. People who got injured seriously enough they had to go to a doctor. So right out of the gate, we can tell that there are 150,000 injuries in Alberta every year. Injuries the government has stats on, they just don't want to tell you about. But we're not done. We got to get to 500,000. So what we need to look at next are those workers, about 13% of us, who don't have WCB coverage. So we can't file a WCB claim. Our injuries aren't counted in their stats. So that jumps the number up to about 175, 176,000. But not all injuries are reported. About 40% of injuries that should be reported to the WCB aren't, for a variety of reasons. So you factor that number in, you're up to about 250,000 injuries. And then there are the injuries that don't have to be reported. These are minor injuries is what you'll hear, right? They're the cuts and the bruises and the burns that we all get on the job every day, but they're still injuries. They're injuries I know I would prefer to avoid at the job. They're injuries we get because the employer put a hazard in our workplace. They put a sharp knife in soapy dishwater, right? We got that injury. It's hard to estimate what that number is, but I would guess it doubles the injury count that we're at. It takes 250,000 and takes it to 500,000. So I'm going to stop at 500,000, but you can go on. You can talk about occupational diseases, which is something I haven't added really into these numbers. Occupational diseases, I mean, gosh, I wouldn't even want to guess at that, but I'm going to guess. I'm going to say another 100,000. Psychological injuries, which are things that aren't compensated here in Alberta. The stress, maybe, of speaking in front of a group of people causes trauma. That's the type of injury that isn't counted, but we've got at least 500,000 injuries in Alberta, and that really tells us 3 things that are important to remember. The first is that Alberta workplaces are exceptionally unsafe places to be. They're dangerous. 1 in 4 is likely going to get injured in a year. The second thing it tells us is the government is consistently understating the level of injury by a factor of 10. They are misleading us about how safe workplaces are. And the third thing it tells us is that Alberta's health and safety system, basically the injury prevention system in Alberta, is clearly a complete and catastrophic failure. It doesn't work. And the question I have is why? Why doesn't the government prevent injuries effectively? So at a basic level, Alberta workplaces are unsafe and they result in injury because employers don't play by the rules. They don't pay attention to health and safety rules and regulations in their workplace. So for example, back in 2011, the government announced that there would be an inspection blitz in, say, residential construction. And they didn't just announce it, they held a freaking press conference. And they said, employers, we're coming out to inspect your work sites. And you know what the employers found? More than half of the employers, half of the 387 employers that were inspected, were found to have violations. So they knew the inspectors were coming, and they still had unsafe work sites. And a quarter of them had work sites that were so unsafe they had stop work or stop use orders. So these were work sites where there was imminent danger of injury or death. This is what happens when they know the inspectors are coming on a blitz. So what's it going to be like in Alberta work sites? It's on an average day, when your average inspector is going to get around to a work site maybe once every 14 years. It's going to be pretty dangerous. This is why the work sites are so dangerous. Now, inspectors don't just do random inspections, right? Sometimes they get a phone call. So if I go out for a walk and I call in that there's a roofing crew and they're up there without fall protection and they're going to fall down on some debris and perhaps danger themselves, anybody want to guess how long it takes a government inspector to come out on average? 6 months. Okay, well that's a little more ambitious than I was going for, but you got the right idea. 18 days. Lots of work sites don't even exist for 18 days, particularly in things like construction. So there's really no chance an employer is ever going to get busted, either through a random inspection or if a worker calls in. And workers are smart. They know if they call in, nothing's going to happen. They don't bother to call in. Employers also know that if they violate the law and if they get busted, there's no penalty. Most of the time what happens, an inspector comes out, sees something and tells the employer, simply fix it up. Right, so if you're an employer, there's no consequence to having an unsafe work site. Now, Alberta does prosecute a few employers, a handful, anywhere from 10 to 20 each year, but only when an employer kills or maims a worker, and does so in an egregiously negligent manner. The fines that you get out of prosecution tend to be small. They're usually levied years after the event, and, in a bit of a shock to me, they're tax deductible. It means they're taxpayer-subsidized fines. Now, if you get a good lawyer, if you're an employer here, pay attention. If you get a good lawyer, your lawyer can get your taxpayer-subsidized fine paid to an employer safety association. So your taxpayer-subsidized fine gets paid to other employers to do the safety work that you should have been doing in the first place. What a joke of a system. Now, the government is talking a little bit about ticketing unsafe work sites, just like you get a ticket if you were speeding. Ticketing is an interesting issue, but they've been talking about this since 2004, so I'm going to believe it when I see it. But really, there's no chance of getting busted, and there's no chance of a penalty if you break the law, and that contributes to unsafe workplaces. So then I want to know, why does the government do such a crap job of enforcing the rules, right? So I think there are a couple of reasons. The first is that the government faces really no consequences when workers get injured and maimed on the job. If you're a worker and you get injured and you get on WCB, chances are you're not going to complain because you're going to worry you're going to lose your benefits. So workers' compensation becomes a means to manage worker discontent. It gives workers something to lose. Now, if you're a worker who isn't on WCB benefits, maybe you're not injured or you couldn't file a claim or your claim got rejected, why don't you complain? Well, as workers, you're not stupid. You know that if you complain, you're going to get fired. Now, when I say that, everybody jumps on me and they say, oh, if people were getting fired for reporting safety stuff, that'd be all over the press because that's illegal. And that's wrong-headed for two very, very clear reasons. The first is nobody threatens a worker. If you report that, you're going to get fired. They very, very subtly suggest that it would be in your best interest not to report something like that. Gosh, it would affect our safety record, might affect our ability to bid on contracts if you report that injury or that lack of safety. And workers are not stupid. They know that that means they're going to get the boot, and even though it's illegal, they're never going to get their job back. The other reason it's wrong-headed is because the press doesn't care. This summer, we had an instance at McEwan University where a cleaner got sexually assaulted on the job by her co-worker. Do you know what the employer did? She reports it to the employer. The employer fires the cleaner and her mom, who also happened to work there. Zero press coverage, despite the fact that SEIU, one of the unions, held a press conference, and that is, objectively speaking, fantastic story. That's something that should have led in the paper, but there's zero coverage. Now, inadequate enforcement also reflects, and this always pisses Gil off when I say it, so my apologies, Alberta has a weak labor movement. We have a weak labor movement. We've had 60 years of the government structuring labor laws, making it difficult, sometimes impossible to unionize. And they do that to keep workers docile and compliant and keep costs down for employers. So one of the few mechanisms by which workers might successfully resist unsafe work gets cut off at the knees. And you know, employers have powerful lobbies in Alberta. Every time there's a minimum wage increase mooted, you hear the employer lobby howl. They say, we can't afford another 25 cents an hour for our workers. Workers who are making absolutely the minimum wage far below the poverty line. And often these employers are able to turn back or at least stall minimum wage increases. And Alberta politicians know you don't cross powerful employers. So the upshot of this is Alberta's occupational health and safety system has been captured by employers. So here's a boring academic tidbit. Regulatory capture is a thing in political science. And it basically means when a state agency, or it occurs when a state agency that's supposed to regulate stakeholders in the public interest suddenly gets captured or taken over, often quite quietly, by one of the stakeholders. And suddenly that regulatory agency starts regulating in the interest of one of those stakeholders, in the interest of employers. And that's what's gone on in Alberta. And the evidence is really overwhelming, and you can read about it in my forthcoming book chapter. But the evidence is quite overwhelming. Most visibly, the health and safety system doesn't prevent injury, which is its whole point. But it also allows employers to organize work in an unsafe manner, right? Because that's usually the cheapest way to organize work. And that allows it, and I'm going to go all Marxist here on you for a minute, to transfer some of the cost of production onto workers and their families and society in the form of injuries. Now, Alberta's occupational health and safety system is also largely funded by employers, which is a surprise to a lot of people. In 2009, Alberta spent $23 million on injury prevention efforts. $22 million of that came from employer premiums that were paid to the WCB, and the WCB transferred those premiums to the government to do quote-unquote injury prevention work. Now, if the government starts lowering the boom on employers, maybe put some of these guys in jail for killing workers, as the government could well do you really think that the WCB is going to continue to transfer that money? Bureaucrats know that that's a danger. If they're too good at their jobs, they're actually going to have their budgets cut. Now, the government's also spent a lot of time, and I recognize I'm getting close to the end, am I? 5 minutes, yeah. A lot of time blaming workers for their injuries. The most egregious example of this recently is the 2008 Bloody Lucky safety campaign. Anybody remember that? No? Okay, it's a series of videos. You can go online at bloodylucky.ca that basically blame workers, in this case young workers, for their injuries. So there's a young lady, she works in a shoe store, she's got fancy high heels on, she goes up a rickety ladder, reaches to get some stock that's stacked quite precariously. She falls backwards, the stock falls and shatters an unguarded light, and she falls on the glass, and the tagline is, "Some days are bloodier than others, womp womp." Clearly in that video, they are blaming that worker for that injury. But you think about what happened there. Who told her what kind of shoes to wear in the workplace? Well, the employer did, right? It's a shoe store. They're not going to let her wear ladder-safe treads when she's trying to sell high-end shoes. Who gave her the shitty ladder, right? The employer did. Who stacked the stock high? Well, the employer did. The employer was trying to save money on back-end merchandise space, so they put the stack. Who didn't guard the light? The employer didn't guard the light. So who's really at root fault for that injury? It's the employer, but the government never engages that. They just blame the worker. The other thing we've seen recently is that the government is cheerleading employer efforts to blame workers. So employers have recently been trying to impose random drug testing in some Alberta workplaces. We hear most about that in the energy and the construction sectors, but Gil tells me it's elsewhere as well. Now, the rationale for drug testing is that it's supposed to make workplaces safer. It's supposed to reduce the number of injuries because we'll have fewer impaired workers. And that, of course, then trumps any privacy concerns that workers might have. The interesting thing is, when you look at the evidence, there is no evidence, not very little, there's no evidence that random drug testing reduces the occurrence of occupational injuries. No evidence. But focusing the attention on workers through drug testing, well, that blames workers for those workplace injuries, those darn stoned workers, right? You can't turn your back for a minute on those workers. They're token up. And it also obscures the role the construction and the energy industries have in the drug use that does go on. And there is drug use in Alberta workplaces, particularly in the energy and the construction sectors, but it obscures the role of the employer. So here's what happens. These employers rapidly expand their workforce. And they hire a lot of contingent workers who travel often. I was on a flight from Halifax on Wednesday. Wow, that was an eye-opener. They hire people who have to travel a long distance away from their families. And then they put them in these isolated work camps, and they pay them a lot of money, and they give them nothing to do, and they work them very hard. And it's not surprising that some workers are going to smoke up. That's just going to happen. So what do employers do? Do they deal with that kind of structural problem? No, they start disciplining workers who smoke a little bit of weed. So what happens to the workers? Well, they go, well, geez, I don't want to get disciplined and fired. So they then turn to drugs, harder drugs. Crack, meth, cocaine, those drugs are much harder to detect. So we blame the workers for that. But in fact, it's the structural factors that the employer has created that are the root cause here. And then we must go back to the basic question. Does drug testing reduce the number of injuries in Alberta workplaces? No, there's no evidence of that. It's just a sham. So I recognize I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to wrap this up in 100 words or less. So when I look at occupational health and safety in Alberta, I see a couple of things. I see a system that doesn't prevent injuries. In fact, it allows 500,000 injuries a year. I see a system that allows employers to continue to structure work in unsafe ways. And it in fact provides them with liability protection when they do that through workers' compensation. If you file the WCB claim, you can't sue your employer even if they were grossly negligent in your injury. And I see a system that gives the government political cover by blaming workers for their injuries rather than placing the blame on employers. And this system undermines the rights of all Albertans to healthy and safe workplaces. It's an arrangement that's not democratic, and it's certainly not in the public interest, and rather it reflects collusion between the state and employers to maintain the status quo. And the people who bear the cost of that are workers. Thanks for your time.
Thanks a lot. Okay, excellent. So now it's time for you folks to do some work. You've been sitting down. So now we need to pull together some of these ideas. We've got Gil's talk about some of the major dangers of the. How can I explain it? You heard it, and then the workplace safety thing. So, who's got a comment? Who's got thoughts? How did it? Let's start with Mr. Fink.
One of the things I was thinking about in terms of what Gil. One of the things I was thinking about in terms of what Gil said was that you're still kind of thinking in terms of the framework in which we're not really citizens. And we shouldn't be paying taxes and then be represented. And, you know, I mean, obviously the royalties in this province are a joke. But as Norway shows, the whole idea of royalties is to plan for the period, you know, after the oil is gone, you know, to build something, not to save us from having to pay taxes like everybody else. And I think in many ways, looking over at the occupational safety stuff, and it's true for almost everything else, we do in this province have a feeling that we're not citizens and politics isn't important, and it really doesn't matter who governs, because ultimately we pay extremely low taxes, and we maybe don't get the greatest services, but it's got very little to do with us in a sense. And you know, just thinking, you know, in comparison with what I've read about Norway, where they pay very high taxes, by the way, in Norway. If somebody was earning the kind of money that I make, would be paying 60% of everything that they earn in taxes, and mostly they don't complain. And actually, most people who work on the rigs and who actually make the kind of money I make would also be paying that kind of wage. In this province, no party thinks that oil workers or me should be paying a penny extra in taxes. And I think our problems are much more serious. I mean, I'll just sum up and put it in the question: is Andrew Nikiforuk not right that in fact we've become completely dependent, and we have a whole dialogue in which we don't really think of ourselves as citizens. We just think of the question of what more, maybe a little bit, could the oil companies provide, and it leaves us feeling that really we have no right as citizens to demand anything, not even occupational safety.
You guys want?
Okay, that was a great question, and I think that basically what Alvin is saying is that we're stuck in a frame that's been constructed by the oil industry and serves their interest, and until we kind of push out of that frame, we'll never get to the point where we can take control not only of our democracy but our resources as well. I agree with that, and I don't want to sound defensive, but the labor movement and our partners like the Parkland Institute, like Public Interest Alberta, we actually have launched campaigns about not just royalty reform but taxation reform. There was a campaign called Better Way Alberta before the last election, and we actually, as a group and a coalition, tried to initiate a discussion about taxes and royalties. We had some success in convincing the New Democrats, and to a slightly lesser extent the Liberals, to talk about taxes and royalties, but it got blown out of the water as a result of this kind of personality contest between Danielle and Allison, right? And so it was sidelined. However, I agree with you that there's absolutely no doubt that that what needs to happen is what Andrew was talking about. We need to take the oil money off the table, and start paying for our services through taxation. And in terms of the conversation about, like, the concern I raised is our approach to development of the oil sands. My argument is that the approach that we're taking, which is a completely hands-off approach, is actually hurting the economy. It's hurting workers. It's undermining our labor market. And I guess one of the things that I take away from Andrew's talk this morning is that it's not enough for us to talk about that approach to development. We'll never be able to have a conversation about the approach to development until we take over our democracy again, right? So take the money off the table, take the oil money off the table, which will allow us to start thinking like citizens. Once we start thinking like citizens, we can have a real democracy. And once we have a real democracy, we can develop the oil sands in a way that's more responsible and in the long-term best interest of that's a long chain of events. But I think, it was very useful for Andrew to say that the starting point is actually getting the money off the table, because it's that money that's on the table that's undermining our democratic institutions. And without democratic institutions, we can't take control of the development of our resources.
Bob, did you have nothing on this? Okay, I think this woman right here.
My question refers to the very much publicized potential accident with the Ferris wheel this summer in Edmonton. And as we understood it, there were 2 or 3 days. One father noticed that the Ferris wheel it wasn't put up properly, and he had quite a difficulty to get any attention to that. My question is there? We never heard about what responsibility the company was held for, or any payment. Would you have any information on that?
Yeah, so this is totally news to me, so I have nothing to say specifically, other than I have my own Ferris wheel story from Heritage Park in Calgary. And the workers, under the time pressure of their employers, had worked around the integral safety mechanisms by extending the lever. And that is the kind of incident that puts them at risk, and also the riders at risk. The assumption that I think typically underlies occupational health and safety and other sorts of safety enforcement in Alberta is that employers have done right. The assumption is of employer innocence, despite the risk that entails. But I'm sorry, I don't have anything in particular about that.
Okay, next question is here, and then we'll go here, and then up there.
Thanks for your presentations. I guess I've been struck by the narrative approach that you were sharing, Gil, and it's a narrative of we have to get it out of the ground as soon as possible. And there have been some voices that have opposed that, including blessed be his memory, Peter Lougheed, who was unsuccessful in advancing that approach, that we should be pacing. We should put brakes on the pace of this. And I think a lot of that was good that you started there, because a lot of these problems evolve from that kind of hands-off approach, that unregulated pace of development. Because then we're always back on our heels. We're always reacting. We can never be proactive. So the question I have is, what are the how do we put forward a different narrative, a narrative not of get it out of the ground as fast as you can, but get it out of the ground in a way that manages the risks as well as the benefits? There.
Well, it's it's gotten to the point where even people in industry recognize that there's a big problem with the pace of development. And in fact, before the global recession in 2008, there was a concerted effort made on the part of the big oil companies. They established a roundtable. They had meetings. They said, we really need to slow down the pace of development because it's driving up costs. But they proved completely unable to regulate their own pace, because while they agreed that some projects should delay, they couldn't agree on who would actually delay first. Right, so it's like, yeah, someone should do that, but it should be you. And if you think about it, it's inevitable, because each of those corporations have investors who have expectations about development, about profit, about return, and so they all have all sorts of overwhelming internal incentives and pressures to develop as quickly as possible, because that's just the way corporations work. They invest their money to make money. And if you're not digging a hole, if you're not extracting resources, you're not making money, right? So the bottom line is we simply cannot rely on industry to regulate itself when it comes to pace. That means that if we're concerned about pace, then the only institution that can regulate the pace and set a more reasonable pace is government. I would argue that should be seen as a central thing for government to do, because they are the stewards of the resource that we own collectively. However, we've got an ideological problem here. We've got a government that in all of its incarnations, whether it was Ed Stalnick or Alison Redford or, heaven forbid, Ralph Klein, these guys have bought this line that government can't be in the business of business, and it frustrates me because we're not talking about shoes, we're not talking about widgets, we're not talking about hamburgers, we're talking about a resource that we own collectively. So we're the owners, and they don't seem to understand that as owners we are necessarily part of the business equation, right? They like, what other business where someone owns an asset would it be seen as illegitimate for the owner of the asset to have a say in how the asset is spent or developed? I mean, it's absurd. I mean, even by the logic of their own argument, we should be saying, because we embrace business logic, we should be setting a reasonable pace. So, whenever I have this conversation with our members, even with people in business, they get it when it's framed properly. Unfortunately, I can't convince people in government. Last week I sat down with Doug Horner, the finance minister, and he was still on this, riding the horse about big government can't be in the business of business. It's so deeply ingrained. It's become one of these political ideological frames that has been repeated over and over again for the last 40 years. And politicians, frankly, they're not deep thinkers. They like intellectual shortcuts, and this is a shortcut that has served them well. So, I mean, it is a big challenge. So the labor movement, at least the Federation of Labour, has come out strongly in terms of slowing down the pace, which may seem like a counterintuitive position for labor, but that's the position we take. We've been putting pressure on some of the political parties to take the same position, and honestly, it's a big hill. But if we can find more allies, I think we should push for it, because it's something that the time has come for a discussion about pace.
I think that's just radical talk. That's crazy. That's what the Premier would say right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Teresa Turner from Manning, Alberta. And up there, we just stopped that proposed nuclear plant that was going to destroy Lake Cardinal, also known as Bear Lake. And we're very aware that this helps slow down the pace of tar sands development. We have a massive family up there, all intermarried with Cree people. And one of my brothers has the land adjacent to the Webo Ludwig property, and they've really fought to stop the gas flaring that kills basically all mammals and causes a lot of birth defects. And I'm wondering if each of you, and thank you for your wonderful presentations, if each of you might say something about the link between the waged workforce, both unionized and non-unionized, these tens of thousands of non-unionized workers who are in the oil operations and related industries, and the relationship between those waged and unwaged wage workers, both unionized and non-unionized on the one hand, and on the other hand, wives, farmers, students, the unemployed, the elderly, who are really bearing the real cost, but the cost that is so hard to see. You know, the woman whose husband returns with a sexually transmitted disease or a drug problem, or just totally alienated, disoriented, and messed up, and destroys the family fabric. The destruction of communities, the destruction of, I know a lot of people in the north were relying on cutting a few trees each year to make some money for their upkeep while they're elderly, and yet they see the pine beetle has destroyed those trees. So they have the oil companies directly, through climate change, eliminating their nest egg for their retirement, and they look forward to poverty. So there's all these impacts that don't seem to be captured in your wonderful presentations. You can't do everything, but what are the unions doing? What are the academics doing with respect to this vast, this 90% of the people that are really suffering?
It's a big question. And the heart of the question is, what do we do to mitigate the downsides of resource development? And the resource sector is a unique sector in many ways, because a lot of the work is done in far-flung locations, and that means that workers have to, spend long periods of time away from their homes. And for the workers, like our members who are up in those camps, it's, the experience of doing camp work and living a camp life. It undermines family life. It undermines community life. The rates of drug abuse, alcoholism, family dissolution. They're all through the roof, right? And we as a labor movement do everything we can to negotiate the best possible contracts so that the workers get home more often, that the life in camp is, less like a prison, and we've had some success. If most of you probably haven't been up there. I know there's a couple of people from Fort McMurray here, but some of the camps have now become palatial, right? They not because the companies really care about the workers, but it's because of this tight labor market. So they're trying to attract people. So some of these camps actually have movie theaters and gyms and I won't say 5-star cafeterias, but maybe 3. But that doesn't, all of that you can only go so far. That doesn't address a lot of your concerns about the effect on the social fabric. And for me, it goes back to pace. And when it comes to the development of our resources, which we own collectively, there's really only three ways that ordinary Canadians can get their piece of the pie, right? And we deserve a piece of the pie because we own the resources. And the first is jobs, the second is wages from those jobs, and the third is royalties. And we have to find a way to make sure that the jobs are good jobs, that the wages are decent, and that we collect fair royalties, and that we invest them in things that actually help build our society. So, that's not happening right now. We're giving away our resources at bargain basement prices, and if we collected more, we could save more, we could invest in things that strengthen the social fabric instead of pull it apart. If we adopted a more reasonable pace to development, people wouldn't have to spend 20 years of their careers out in the bush. They might be able to alternate a little bit more between in-town work and out-of-town work. There's no easy answer. When the resources are out there, there's going to be that model of development, right? And it's just a question of finding ways to mitigate the downsides.
I'm going to try and come at this recognizing we have very little time left, I think. Yeah. From maybe a little bit more intellectual or... Okay, that's unfair. I didn't mean to say that wasn't intellectual, Gil. From a bit more of an academic perspective, that's a better way to say it. Governments have to attend to a couple of things, and mostly what we talk about is how governments attend to the needs of production, right? They go out and they change the rules to make it easier to exploit oil. They go out and ensure that workers are vulnerable and have to comply to the demands of employer. That's about production. But governments also have to attend to the needs of social reproduction. Social reproduction are those things that have to happen in order for society and the circumstances that allow production to occur to go on. So we have to educate children, we have to have children, right? We have to educate children and raise them. We have to take care of the sick and the elderly. Somebody has to cook and clean. Somebody had to do my laundry this morning. Those things are falling apart in Alberta. That's my sense anyways. You look at the 91,000 children, was it 91,000 children that were found to be living in poverty in Alberta? That was in the paper the other day. I mean, those aren't circumstances which are conducive to a healthy society, or in fact even to the continuation of production. And I think that governments, particularly this conservative government, which is certainly an oil government, but also tends to talk about being a family values government, I think they're vulnerable on these things. If they don't attend to the needs of social reproduction, it becomes quite apparent that they are in fact just oil whores. So I think that is a lever that can be used to address some of the concerns that I heard you to be raising, that we ought not focus solely on the needs of workers, although I think that's important, but also on all of those people who don't necessarily have a waged position, but are in fact indispensable to the day-to-day conduct of our lives. Sure.
Great, thanks. I'm going to try and squeeze in two quick questions here. So it's going to be discipline on your guys's and your guys's. So we have 8 minutes. Let's see what we can do. Trevor's going to be first, and then Eric. There's parity happening here, so.
Thanks. So thank you, Gil. I think the conversation about temporary foreign workers is important, and I think blaming and shaming is important. I was wondering if you could talk about if there's any conversations happening on not just that aspect of it, but of organizing, of really getting out there and educating these people about their rights, and working with established immigrant communities to educate them about their rights and to get them organized and to help work with them so that they can work within their communities to build capacity within the temporary foreign worker community.
Two main streams of temporary foreign workers. There are the skilled workers and the unskilled workers. And the unskilled workers are more vulnerable in a lot of ways because they have fewer bargaining chips at the table, right? They're disposable, more disposable. And as a result, they're the ones who are suffering sort of a disproportionate amount of abuse at the hands of employers, whether it's Tim Hortons or McDonald's or whatever. The one positive thing about the service sector workers, they tend to be in urban centers where we can actually talk to them. And so even though they're very reluctant to come out, because most of them want to come, they come here hoping eventually to become citizens, even though for most of them there's no clear avenue for citizenship. So they want to be citizens. A lot of them are willing to put up with a lot of crap in order to stay here. So our challenge has always been trying to get in touch with them, but at least in the urban centers, we can find them, and we have. And in fact, just yesterday I was sitting down with a group of from the faith communities, immigrant communities, and so we are building networks. We're trying to tell their stories, and we've had some success in raising the profile of the issue. We have been working with immigrant settlement groups as well, and that will continue. The good news is that for years we struggled, because Alberta was sort of ground zero for the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program. As I said in my presentation, the expansion actually resulted as it was a reaction to the expansion of the oil sands. But now it's nationwide. You've heard about the stories in BC. There are stories in Ontario, and so the national labor movement is now starting to pay attention. Our social partners, civil society, have sort of discovered this issue over the last 6 months or a year in a way that wasn't the case before. So I see that as promising. For the skilled workers, there's a real challenge, because most of the skilled workers are being dropped into the bush in Fort McMurray. And even though they have a few more bargaining chips because they have skills that the employers need, a lot of them are being brought in en masse in groups and dropped into these remote work sites. In many cases, it's an entire language group. Their managers are from the same ethnic group. They never come through a city. They don't land in Edmonton or Calgary. They land on an airstrip that the company has built in the wilderness, right? So these guys don't know their rights. We have no access to them. And the most troubling example was the tank farm collapse at the Horizon work site. That was a group of Chinese construction laborers. 2 of them were killed when the tank collapsed. And we know now that they were using construction practices that would never be approved in Canada. So they imported a Chinese labor force, but along with it, they brought Chinese managers, and they imported Chinese labor practices, and people died as a result. And so the question is, where were the inspectors? They weren't there. They came after the collapse. Some of the companies involved have been charged, but it's really just a slap on the wrist compared to what's happened. So I mean, we're working on it, but it's a big challenge, especially for those who we can't get access to.
I think this will be probably the last question that we'll get to. So why don't you finish?
I think it's useful to interrogate the phrase temporary foreign workers. Right? So they are temporary on an individual basis because they can only be here for 4 years unless they choose to stay afterwards as non-status or illegal, if you prefer that term, migrants, which is happening in increasing numbers. But as a group, they are not temporary. They are a permanent structural part of our labor force at the bottom end. So when we call them temporary foreign workers, and this is not a criticism of you because I use that phrase too, we are in fact saying the opposite of the truth. When we talk about foreign workers, what that brings to mind is citizenship. They are not, that focuses on citizenship. They are not Canadian citizens, and that is used to justify the fewer rights foreign workers have and the greater difficulty they have in exercising the rights they do have. What's important about that distinction, that focus on citizenship, is it obscures the racist element of the temporary foreign worker program. It is a racist program because temporary foreign workers, by and large, aren't old fat white guys like me. They're brown people, they're frequently women, and they're going to be linguistic and ethnic minorities. It is part of a long-term colonial project by the West to strip wealth from the developing world and bring it to our country. We used to just go and take it. Now we bring their people here to develop that wealth in Alberta. And nobody wants to talk about the racist nature of temporary foreign workers, but I think that is in fact something that the federal government is particularly vulnerable on. But based on the stares I'm getting, that's not necessarily a widely held belief. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Great. Thanks. Okay, just a few quick announcements, and then we'll finish this off. First of all, conference media sponsor CJSR has people on site all weekend, and they're posting podcasts of many of the speakers. So if you've missed anything or our concurrent session, you can go to cjsr.com. Lunch is very important. If you have a happy smiley face on your name tag, that means that you purchased lunch as part of your package. It's available in the lower level of the North Lecture Theaters, outside the lower doors of the big room we were just in. So I suspect there will be a lot of volunteers that will point us in the correct direction once we get out to that main area. There's a conference evaluation in your packet. Please fill that out. And that's it. Thank you very much, Gil and Bob. And we have a gift for each of you.